So my name's Sarah Wigglesworth, and I was Professor of Architecture at the school in Sheffield between 1997 and 2016. I was part-time professor, and I have been running my practice, Sarah Wigglesworth Architects, which is based in London, since about, what would it be, 1993 or 4. So the whole way through my teaching career, I've also been in practice, and I've always been very, very interested, principally interested actually, in the relationship between practice and academia, or, you know, doing and thinking. And I think the two don't always come together very easily, but I kind of made it my mission to try and bring the two closer together. And one of the things that our practice really tries hard to do is to use research, I mean, proper sort of thinking very hard and getting data and statistics and analyzing what we know about the places that we work in, and using that as knowledge to found the things that we end up designing and the way that we work with the people we work with, the communities we work in. And I was very interested in bringing that into the Sheffield arena as well, because I think that having practitioners within the academic arena, especially when you're in a vocational subject like architecture, is absolutely critical, because otherwise, you know, I mean, there is a tendency to have separate spheres anyway, but I think otherwise we just reinforce those boundaries and we don't ever speak to each other, and we become more and more unable to do so because we begin to speak different languages and we don't share the same goals at all. So that was what I tried to do. And it finished actually with a research project called Dwell, which is designing for well-being in environments for later life, which was actually a design research project, interdisciplinary, so it involved planners and people from public health and so forth, on the basis that, you know, design is a research tool in its own right, and that by understanding and working with older people who are our sort of co-collaborators, we would do a better job of really understanding what it was that was driving this agenda than if we, you know, didn't talk to them. And I do think that's a sort of feminist agenda, because I think by understanding the users of our work, hopefully we come closer to really understanding what the impact of our work is, and therefore inflecting it towards making the lives of the people we honor better. And that includes women very largely, especially for me. So I was at Sheffield for 18 years and reflecting, actually 19 years, and reflecting back on that, I think the school is a really different place now than it was then. And albeit, they know it's a long time ago now, but when Jeremy and I were appointed in 97, I think it was, the school really had a reputation for being sort of northern, so that connected it with being manufacturing and, you know, heavy industry, that kind of thing. And it was a construction school with a school that emphasized technology and all the research that it did on that. And again, you know, those kinds of activities tend to be gendered masculine. And so I would say that its sort of reputation in architecture fields was for being not exactly macho, but certainly having a kind of masculine side to it. And when we were appointed, I mean, I think there wasn't another female professor, certainly not in architecture. And I think there was one in landscape who actually interviewed me at the time, but they were rare. And I remember asking in my interview about the glass ceiling, and everyone was a bit shocked by that, but I thought it was really important because I didn't want to be appointed to feel like I just had nowhere to go, you know, and that I was a freak somehow in a an environment where those kinds of things, you know, I was an anomaly really, compared with the other departments. And anyway, the the Vice Chancellor assured me that, of course, there wasn't a glass ceiling. And I mean, that may or may not have been right, but you know, there was not a very heavy presence of women in the department. Now, you know, I wouldn't necessarily equate numbers with an attitude, but of course, numbers do matter a bit, because I think they begin to change the culture and the things that people feel they have a license to say and do, and the interests that they pursue. So, I mean, all of that did not disappear overnight, believe me, and it took a long time to kind of turn the tanker around in a different direction. But I think the seeds of the change were already there. And I mean, partly Prue was very instrumental in that, because she'd already done quite a lot of work really rethinking what architecture is and who it's for, which I think I personally read as a critique of the kind of technical, rational sort of underpinnings that often attaches to architecture, and I think certainly did attach to the Sheffield School at that time. And there were other people there working on sort of methods of communication, which again, I think, you know, thinking back to how it was, you know, there was an emphasis on architecture being a very sort of elite and rather erudite and rather sort of special expertise. And in the sort of Howard Rorkean sense of the sort of genius maverick artist whose way of thinking and doing should never be compromised, you know, conceptually pure and all the rest of it, I think was really, you know, under scrutiny and being undermined by this idea that actually we needed to communicate with communities and clients and users in order to understand better how our building, what architecture did and how our buildings and concepts really were relevant to society. And I do see this as part of a kind of swing of the pendulum away from elitist thinking to being much more embedded in the people who are on the receiving end of the kinds of things that we produce as architects. And of course, feminism plays into that, because I think that, you know, the feminist project is about critiquing patriarchal ways of thinking, which I think were the underpinnings to that kind of architectural perception, and sort of bring it back down to earth again. And it had a sort of social component to it. It had a sort of radical component to it as well. And certainly when I came along, I mean, I think Prue's sort of take on feminism was not as radical as mine. And when I arrived, I had been involved in the publication of a document called Desiring Practices. In fact, it was a conference, a sort of symposium, and a book and a series of exhibitions that had taken place in London in 1995. And it was one of those defining moments for me, because having experienced sexism as I saw it during my education and early career and teaching, you know, a group of us decided to do something about it, but to actually make the link between concepts and work, you know, the production of architecture. And although it was exhibition, as well as papers, the point was that it made the leap into the material cultures, which we thought was really important. And sort of having worked through that, for me, was defining, because I think once I really understood it, you could never turn back and become anything different. So it became absolutely the bedrock of everything I thought and did. And, you know, and that wasn't going to change. It was like a sort of really defining moment. So I wanted to put that in the forefront. And of course, at the time I joined, we were just starting to build Stock Orchard Street, which is the place I'm sitting in at the moment, which is a house and an office. And there's a feminist agenda for me behind that as well. And there are not very many overtly feminist buildings in the UK. And I felt very strongly that, you know, that was a sort of a marker as well about the kind of intentions that I wanted my practice, and by practice, I mean, I'm including teaching, to bring about. So I think that became more overt. And of course, I think Jeremy has been influenced by my personal take on feminism. And he began to recruit people in a much more equitable way. And in fact, at one point, while I was at Sheffield, I think we had something like 7 female professors or something. I mean, it was more than any other school of architecture. And I think that kind of leadership became really important. I think probably the most cataclysmic thing to have happened was Ruth Morrow being appointed as the leader of year 1, because at year 1, you're getting students who know nothing about architecture. And so there's a chance to begin to influence the whole of the school moving upwards. And she may or may not have realized what she was doing, but I think she was playing into an overtly, you know, feminist agenda for undercutting the old ways of thinking and bringing about something new. And I think that was a really amazing sort of transformation to the school. So, I mean, each of us, I think, who were interested in this topic were working on it in different ways. And as I'm putting it, you know, Ruth was working from the ground up. I think I was working at it just through everything I was talking about, doing, you know, setting as projects and all the rest of it. And, you know, we were lecturing about it. My inaugural was on that subject and so on. So I think it became a very important strand in the work of the school. But I mean, I would still say that it wasn't that mainstream until probably the cohort of Ruth students came all the way through. I think something else happened halfway through, which was Joanna Petrescu came on board. And, you know, she brought a kind of Middle European exoticism to it with, you know, touching the hem of the garments of some really important French feminists. And I think that put a kind of more international flavor to it. And she, you know, brought on board more, I would say, sort of series of targeted workshops that overtly brought the issue out into the open. I didn't really have that much to do with those. And that's partly because being part-time and having very little spare time to spend on those things, I wasn't really able to take part. But I would say that one of the things that has kind of begun to dominate the conversation, which probably wasn't addressed that much in the school at that time, were aspects of inclusion, which I think are very much more to the forefront nowadays. And that's all about, you know, a whole range of different inclusions, including BAME, you know, neurological issues and so on and so forth, like the ways in which different people experience the environment. I think we still weren't as inclusive as we could have been. And I think that's also true in terms of perhaps my relationship with the school, because personally, because I was part-time and running a practice and not in Sheffield, you know, it actually made inclusion of my contribution, I think, more difficult to take on board. Having said all that, the point of inclusion is to make that possible. And I think that sometimes that wasn't done. And so I think the contribution I could have made to some of that was perhaps neglected a bit, and that's a shame. I think the other dimension to it is practice. My sense about academia is that it's easier to be a feminist in academia than it is in practice. And that's because, in a sense, you're in a smaller bubble of people who probably are more able to understand and embrace what it is you're doing. And you're in a safe space with other people who are, on the whole, civilized and give you room to say what you think. And there are more women in academia, I think, who are interested in these issues. So it's more commonplace, less weird, let's put it that way. And, you know, and one of the reasons there are more women and it's more of a safe space for women to say these things is because, you know, it's an attractive place to be, partly because, you know, you have a career path, you have job security, and you have maternity leave and all of those things, and a pension, which all come with, you know, that job. In my world of, you know, precarity and having to earn a living out of your own, you know, volition and your own resources, you don't have that to fall back on. And, you know, you're struggling in an environment where, you know, those ideas are sort of theoretical, literate ideas are not necessarily shared by the people you're, you know, dealing with all the time. And, you know, it's well understood that the construction industry in particular, but also lots of the consultants we deal with, you know, they're very practical people. They're not as well versed in the issues, and they don't operate amongst many women. So you've got a whole series of barriers to what you're doing. And I think that's often not really appreciated in a school of architecture, you know. And I feel that side of things was not really, the discussion of those kinds of things was not really taken on board, perhaps, and not really regarded as very important. And yet for me, that was the most important aspects of what I was doing, because in a sense that was addressing the major structural issues that pertain to our industry, you know. And academia is a little kind of nice little bubble over here, you know, which is, relatively speaking, doing quite well in these things. So my fault probably for not perhaps banging that drum and making that more apparent and embedding it more in what I did. But, you know, yeah, there we go. Thinking about it, I think that Sheffield at a certain point in time, which is probably in the mid to late 2000s, could have been regarded as the first feminist school in the UK. And, you know, I'm really proud to have been associated with that and helped perhaps to create, helped create that. And I think that, you know, that issue sort of spins out in a lot of ways. I mean, hopefully we have produced a lot of students who will think about architecture very differently, and where, you know, issues as they pertain to gender and other minorities. I mean, not that women are a minority in the world, but, you know, we're treated a bit like a minority, but that other ways of thinking and other kinds of knowledge and other experiences are taken much more seriously and really begin to sort of dominate the discourse in a more nuanced way. So, and I think those students will go out and, you know, begin to change the world, which is really great. And there are, you know, people have left Sheffield now and have gone back into practice or gone into different institutions, and hopefully they're carrying the message and the ways of thinking into academia and spreading the word that way and changing the way that people do things. And I think that's really great. So, you know, there's some wonderful things happening in Manchester with Praxis, which is actually run by a student that I knew back in Kingston when I taught there, long time ago. So that's great to see, you know, new ideas popping up in different schools of architecture. Obviously, Ruth's now in Newcastle, and that's great, you know, and so is Prue. So another generation of people like Katie Lloyd-Thomas, who's now in Newcastle as well. I think we have demonstrated new leadership roles, and I think that's really important to think about, because I think women have perhaps to find a new way of showing leadership, which is both inclusive but also powerful. And that's not in the old patriarchal way of dominating, but it actually is a different model. And I think we have to learn how to do that. I don't think we're there yet, but I think, you know, we have shown that women can be in leadership roles, and I think we have to rethink what they are. And I try and do that in my practice in a really inclusive way. So I think that's a very interesting thing to talk about, because I think it's a difficult balance between showing a vision, but also being inclusive, bringing people with you and giving them a sense of their own agency, and yet actually providing a way forward, you know, which involves everybody. And I think that's a very difficult line to tread. So I think, I mean, for me, probably the big thing that was missing, I've already touched on it, is this idea of inclusion. And Sheffield is still very white, still very middle class. And, you know, it's probably got a way to go to be inclusive. And I would include in that issues around leadership and vision, so that we're always questioning ourselves about, you know, how we're doing things as much as what we're doing and what the outcomes are. And I still maintain that, you know, the issues that our industry faces on the broader scale are still something which academia doesn't really deal with as much as it should, in my opinion, because I mean, hopefully we are training people not just to go back into academia, but actually to take their knowledge out there and apply it in material circumstances as well. So, you know, obviously that's still to be worked out, because that's the big kind of chestnut at the moment that is still not budging very much. And it's still a really big one. And I think, I mean, perhaps my critique of academia generally is that it still operates in a separate sphere from practice. And I think there's not nearly as much overlap as there should be. And that's, you know, I sort of feel at the end of the time I was at Sheffield that was sort of failure on my part, because I think notwithstanding having tried, I think there wasn't enough of a critical mass of people who were really interested in making that transition, really, sort of, and bringing issues of practice into the academic world and getting it to sort of address some of those issues. And I think partly that's because of funding. It's partly that people are not aware of the issues because they don't operate in that world. And so they're not that aware of what a hostile environment it can be to women operating in, you know, the broader sphere, or how, you know, the underpinnings to everything we deal with through policy and regulation and so forth tend to disadvantage women, you know. So we need to be addressing these things across the board, from, you know, building regulations to planning policies to auditing how the work we do affects the lives of women, how design is organized, the things we prioritize, and so on and so forth. You know, all of these things are shaped by the way we think, and they're not really addressed at a kind of fundamental level, I think, because they happen in practice, you know. So, yeah, you know, career paths and all of that, they also make it very difficult for people to understand what's really going on out there. And, you know, as a one-woman kind of campaign, I think I failed to really make a mark on that. But for me, that is still the biggest issue. And it's probably the main reason why I left Sheffield at the end of the day, because I felt that actually I could be more effective at making change to the things that are precious to me by being in practice, you know, that yeah, that the work really needs to go on the coalface where it's actually happening. And so I've joined a group now called Part W, which is a sort of activist group, which is looking at trying to make change in the industry as it's kind of working out there in the big wide world, as it were. Having said all that, you know, I think my grounding in academia was really important, because I always think of feminism as being a tool to kind of understand and unpack, you know, and sort of filter the things that are happening to you and have ways of dealing with them or rationalizing them when things are very tough, and kind of get under the skin of what's happening, so that you can begin to develop ways of addressing them. You know, they give you a kind of way, a toolbox of ways of addressing them. So I'm very pleased to have had that association. But in summary, it's not really where I think I can be most effective, actually, in the world that I operate in. And I think possibly the work that Sheffield does in reaching out to communities through live project work and so forth, I think really benefits from, you know, the work that the school has done on gender issues and equality and so forth. And that's really great. And I don't know how overt the feminist sort of legacy is on that one, but I think, going back to what I said earlier, you know, the kind of understanding of how architecture needs to come off its pedestal and start sort of addressing social issues, I think is part of the feminist agenda, whether or not people understand it as such. And that is a great legacy. And I think that, you know, the school's done an amazing work in that department. Well, I suppose if a school of architecture were to be truly feminist, it would have to reinvent its curriculum entirely, really. And I mean, I think it would have to be very overt in what it taught, how it taught it, and the people involved in it. I think it would have to be more inclusive and you know, involve more communities of feminists from other, you know, areas, other minority groups and so forth. It probably needs to be more local as well and reflect its sort of constituency. I'd say, you know, how it teaches. I think the Sheffield School of Architecture is a good example of how to do that, sort of by getting people to work collaboratively, to emphasize communication. But actually, if I had one criticism of the Sheffield School, I'd say that perhaps people are a little bit too humble about providing leadership. I found sometimes the students don't really want to put their head above the parapet and make propositions that others could follow or could challenge. And I think that gets to my point that I made earlier about leadership and how to lead and provide vision, but at the same time as make it inclusive. So I think that's still a project that's ongoing. I guess there does need to be a very strong emphasis on collaboration, not competition. And, you know, the basis of our education is always about judging the individual. And I think possibly that needs challenging. I think, I mean, design and all the things that sort of underpin it, as I've mentioned before, like issues around technology and how that's sort of treated within the school, issues of, you know, social life and who takes precedence when you're thinking about how to design, how you communicate with people, the kinds of drawings that you do, forms of representation, all of that is probably up for grabs and needs to be reinvented. So, you know, what is a feminist form of representation? I think that's a really interesting challenge that's probably not thought about sufficiently. And then I think academia, a feminist school of architecture could really step outside of academia and actually make links with the people who are on the receiving end of both its theories and its practice. I think links with practice are critical because I think things are not changing in practice nearly enough. And, you know, to step outside the ivory tower and begin to affect change in the real world is really what I think it could be doing much, much more than it does. And I think particularly in the UK at the moment, with the absence of sort of the big state, let's put it that way. I think universities actually could have a very unique role to play in, you know, because of their institutional robustness, put it that way, in, you know, in civic life, and that they're missing a trick if they don't do that more than they do. But that needs concerted effort. And I think if we, you know, if we want to change women's lives, for the better, we need to get out there and start to really think about how does the work we do affect them. And in places like Vienna, for example, now, you know, they've got a leader there where anything that is done in Vienna has to go through a committee which looks at the effects it has on women. And that's a fantastic move. Now, that's within the local authority. We're not likely to get that here because we don't operate in the same way. But I think that's something that, you know, Feminist Architecture School could be really pushing for as an agenda. So yeah, sort of reaching out to women in communities, I think, is really critical. And I think leading the discourse so that we change the conversation that we're having and bring this really to the fore. You know, in all the indices of, you know, deprivation, violence and so forth, it's women that are on the receiving end of many of the negative things about our society. And I think we have a duty to try and address those. The built environment aids and abets it. And so we're the authors of those conditions. And, you know, we should be doing something about it. So I suppose the underpinning message is I think we need to get out of the ivory tower and begin to affect change in society. And that's the biggest legacy that a feminist school could have.